Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. Today and for the next couple of weeks, we're going to be talking a little bit about the Pensacola and the war between the states. In our last episode, we talked about how the action took place here when secession was voted by the legislature, how Colonel Chase and his militiamen captured Fort Barrancas, Fort McRae, and the Navy Yard, but failed to capture Fort Pickens because of the resistance there and the presence of 65 artillerymen under the command of Lieutenant Adam Slemmer. Well, as all of that happened, this is now about the middle of January 1861, a communication was made with the state legislature and also with Washington, where Senator Mallory, who was of course packing his bag to come home, he was a secessionist now and he had no longer had a position in the Senate, and he and Senator Yulee had decided that was exactly what they would do. But Mallory, hearing the news from Pensacola, made this decision. He said, I am going to go and visit President Buchanan and see if we cannot work out some arrangement to prevent actual hostilities beginning at Pensacola. So he did so. And the two men met, and the decision they made, it comes down in history as the Buchanan-Mallory Truce. And in this is what was agreed to. Number one, the South, that is the Republic of West Florida now, agreed that they would make no overt attack militarily against Fort Pickens. And on behalf of the North agreed that it would not attempt to reinforce the 65 men that were in the fort under Lieutenant Slemmer. And so that's where things stood. And things moved forward through the next 60 days. Mr. Buchanan, of course, was just about to go out of office, and at this point, he would do anything to prevent hostilities from beginning on his watch. And of course, Mr. Lincoln was gathering together the beginnings of his cabinet and making preparations to take office, which he did late in March of that year. Immediately, of course, the cabinet under Mr. Lincoln recognized that they had two very serious public relations problems. One was Fort Sumter, sitting in Charleston Harbor, which remained under Union command. And the second was the situation here at Pensacola, where Fort Pickens, of course, was in federal hands, and the South wanted it. Meanwhile, of course, the South was anxious for something good to happen to get Fort Pickens, because without holding that fort, Pensacola, with its harbor, its docks, its Navy Yard, and its almost complete railroad up to the Alabama border would be useless in the bringing of supplies into the country. And of course, everyone recognized that if war should begin, the North, with its superior Navy, would quickly blockade the eastern ports and make it very difficult for the South to do anything that would sustain their war effort. And so things passed on into the early days of April. As all this happened, of course, people in Pensacola were looking around to see what could they do. This was something brand new. People here were generally very patriotic. People began to say, what can I do for the war effort if war should come? And people began to talk about enlarging the three little military companies that existed here. And of course, people like Ezekiel Simpson and others literally stepped forward and provided money to uniform and equip marching units from Pensacola. Well, we came now, of course, to the day of the 12th of April. And on that morning, some of the boys from the South, who now had been considerably reinforced, they had far more than 600 here by then. These boys were both in the Navy Yard and largely in Fort Barrancas. And on this morning, just about dawn, 2 or 3 of the boys woke up and they took their muskets in hand, took their tin cups, and went up on the parapet to have a cup of coffee. And as they reached there, they looked out to the south, and they saw something that they had not been there at twilight. There, standing off just 150 to 200 yards offshore, was the large armed federal frigate, the U.S. Brooklyn. And coming from the Brooklyn was a whole fleet of small boats, and each one of those boats was jammed full of blue-clad federal soldiers. The North had broken the Mallory-Buchanan truce. Well, Billy Joe and his friends said, this is off. They've broken faith. They picked up their muskets, quickly put a charge in them, and let fire. Well, now, of course, this was purely symbolic. They couldn't hit a thing, and this was over a mile away. But nonetheless, they felt they had to do something, and quickly an officer of the day came up to them and said, stop. but nonetheless, the firing had taken place. About an hour later, from Sullivan's Island in Charleston, South Carolina, cannon fire began against Fort Sumter. So, when one wants to talk about where did the actual firings in the beginnings of the war between the states come first, well, we had the situation here in January at Fort Barrancas, and now we were about an hour before Fort Sumter, and we can record it, at least locally, for our history story. Others would contest that, but the records are fairly strong on this. Well, as all of this happened, of course, now we are obviously facing a situation with war. Now, we must go back about 60 days from April the 12th to the third week in February, because it was then in Montgomery, Alabama, that representatives of 7 southern states had come together and had created the Confederate States of America, the CSA. They had elected Jefferson Davis, the former senator from Mississippi, as the first president, and Mr. Davis very quickly began putting together a very capable cabinet, and he was very wise in what he did. He wanted to be sure that all of these states fell a part of this, and so each one of the 7 states had one cabinet member appointed to it, and the man from Florida was to be Stephen R. Mallory, the former United States Senator from Pensacola. And Mr. Mallory, because of his great experience for 10 years as a member of the Naval Affairs Committee of the Senate, he was named the Southern States Secretary of the Navy. Well, we move forward now into the first days of that conflict. Mr. Chase, Colonel Chase, is replaced by Brigadier General Braxton Bragg, and quickly more and more troops come in here to the point where early in the summer we have gone from about 600 under Chase to almost 6,000. And these men have come from all over. They are representatives of all of the southern states. They're here. They're in training, and of course, as days go by, not everything went well for them, because by May and then into June, it began to get warm. And these are good old Southern boys. They've lived on the farm for the most part, and they have never been exposed to what we would today call childhood diseases. And so, of course, as time passed into the hot weather, we began to see lots of flies and ticks and mosquitoes and all of the things that go with it. And then they began to suffer epidemics of whooping cough, measles, things of that kind, which normally would not affect adults, but by this time these boys were affected, and we had a great deal of illness here, and a relatively small and not too well trained component of federal medical people. Now, of Confederate medical people. Now, of course, the North was facing the same problem. They were getting more reinforcements coming into Fort Pickens. But on the other hand, of course, a lot of the supplies that they would need had to be shipped a great distance, and their diet was poor. And so by the time we got into early June, some of the original men who had been with Adam Slemmer came down with scurvy, and the whole company had to be relieved by ship. Now, as all of this was going on, of course, month after month, the activities here in Pensacola saw, number one, the completion of the Alabama-Florida Railroad up as far as Pollard Junction. And when it reached there, of course, what we had talked about in a prior issue some time back, the Mobile and Montgomery Railroad, which had been under construction at the same time, it was completed. So now there was a trackage. It made it possible, kind of a triangular arrangement, so that it would, if the South could have captured Fort Pickens, it would have been possible to bring in commercial vessels loaded with anything that the South needed. And of course, as they came, the supply line would have taken the materials as needed up into the South. But of course, with Fort Pickens in the hands of the Federals, that could not happen. The South was just totally frustrated. Well, as all of this is taking place, of course, everyone here is sitting at their television sets watching the news from the North, seeing what's happening in the development of the war. And now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that. That's not Pensacola's story. But by the time we get into the late spring, we find the first great battle being fought just outside of Washington at a place called Manassas Junction, right along Bull Run Creek, where a kind of a hit and miss battle is fought, and the Federals are defeated. And this is where we begin to see some names in the imprint on the war. This is where you get from the North names like McClellan and McDowell, and from the South Beauregard and Johnstone. They're all becoming part of the scenario up there. And step by step, over the first couple of months, going into the summer, the South did reasonably well. But then by the time you get into the fall, and we will, I'm perhaps getting a little ahead of the story here, but basically by the time we get into the fall, other federal sources are beginning to move through Kentucky down toward the south, and names that became prominent in the war story, names like Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, are captured by the North, and the South is beginning to be very worried about what's going to happen to their situation in southern Tennessee and in northern Mississippi. Well, as all of this has taken place, of course, the people in Pensacola have been trying to do their part. The women have done all that they could to make things for the soldiers. The local industries, the lumber mills and the turpentine mills and the naval stores processors are making things that can be moved north on the railroad to help sustain people. And of course, this will be part of a little later part of our story, but by now the work of the Naval Secretary, Mr. Stephen Mallory, has succeeded in starting up some new industries in the South. Because when war started, the South was almost denuded of anything like military ordnance factories. But by the time we get into the fall of 1861, plants have been started to make cannon and also to produce iron or steel plate. And these factories were in Selma, Atlanta, and in Richmond, because they needed that plate very badly for the things that Mr. Mallory was going to attempt. Well, we move into the South, into the late summer, and things in Pensacola have just settled down. People can't think of what they can do to help, because they're just sitting there. They're frustrated because of the holding of Fort Pickens. And then one of the families that operated a small shipyard on the Blackwater River, a family by the name of Judah, just about completed something they felt might help. It was a small, what they would call a blockade runner, a fast, small vessel. It was just about ready to use, and they moved it out of the Blackwater and moved it to the Navy Yard, because there were certain deck fittings that the Navy Yard could supply, which the Judahs could not. Now, they made a terrible mistake there. They literally docked the vessel in plain sight of Fort Pickens. Whether they thought the people in Pickens were blind, I have no idea, but they did. Well, the people in Pickens said, all right, we can have none of that. So that night, about 2 o'clock in the morning, under cover of darkness, 2 longboats full of federal soldiers off of the USS Colorado, which was anchored out or was riding out in the Gulf. These 2 small boats came in, slipped through the Narrows, overpowered the guard at the Navy Yard, and killed a few of the men on board the ship, and burned the Judah to the waterline. It was totally destroyed. Well, the next morning, in the coffee houses and the places down along Palafox Street, people were absolutely furious. The mayor, George Boyd, at this point in time, said to himself, "We could have been murdered in our beds. Why? What is the general doing? When is he going to do something?" And of course, as all this happened, a great stir. But for the next few days, nothing happened. And then on the 10th day of October, General Dick Anderson, part of General Bragg's command, put together about 1,000 men, and they were prepared to do something, the sort of thing that the people in Pensacola demanded. They put together this force, organized from the men stationed in the Navy Yard and in Barrancas, and they were ready to move. And the plan was to march by late evening across the 10 or 11 miles to Palafox Street dock, where they were to board barges and tugboats and be towed or carried from Pensacola docks by night around the Santa Rosa Island Peninsula, and be docked about where Pensacola Beach is today, maybe just a little bit further to the east of that. And then they were to march on one side of the island and the other against the soldiers who were in Fort Pickens. And by this time, of course, Fort Pickens had a fairly sizable corps there, including men who were in tents, living not in the fort itself, but to the east side, where there was a cleared area for just that purpose. And so we were ready. It's about 10 o'clock. Here comes the soldiers marching down from the Navy Yard toward Pensacola's docks, and it's dark, and unfortunately, they're late.